Welcome to the Inner Picture Stories podcast. My name is Jellis Vaas, your host and the founder of Inner Picture Stories, the educational platform on life. I hereby invite you to come on a journey with me. In each episode, we will dive into the life of an inspiring person seeking lessons of wisdom about life and the world we live in. Answers that you can take away and use in your own life. It's true that no one ever said life would be easy, but it's also true that no one ever said you had to do it alone. So get ready and let the journey begin. Hello there everyone, a warm welcome to the IPS Podcast. I am so happy to have you here. This episode is a bit different than the normal interviews I do, where I talk with experts from a variety of different fields and draw out lessons that you, in turn, can use in your life. This episode, in fact, is a new kind of episode I like to introduce to the podcast, bonus episodes. Now, these bonus episodes are episodes where guests take over the podcast and answer some of the questions I did not ask in the interview but wanted to. When I do an interview, I often have so many questions for each guest that it is sometimes impossible to ask them all. So I often select which questions will be best suited for the interview. Also, I am often limited by the time guests might have for the interview, so it restricts me on the number of questions I can ask. These bonus episodes, which I will try to do with most of the upcoming guests and some of our past guests too, will be the place where these questions that don't make it in the interview will be asked and answered. Now, in this bonus episode, you will spend some extra time with Craig Stanland. Craig was our guest in the most recent episode, which was episode 028, titled Life After Prison, Craig Stanland, Losing Everything You Have and How to Start Over. Here is a short bio about Craig, so you'll know a little bit about his story and why I interviewed him for the podcast. In 2012, Craig made a decision that would change his whole life. He exploded the warranty policy of one of the world's largest tech companies for his own financial gain. Eventually, however, just under a year after Craig began operating his scheme, the FBI came knocking on his door in October 2013. He was arrested and eventually sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, and a payment of $834,307 in restitution. The interview I did with Craig is truly an incredible episode that goes in depth on the topic of making a mistake, living with shame, how to work through it, and how to forgive yourself. Therefore, if you enjoyed this bonus episode with Craig, then you will love the interview. Again, that's episode 028. With that, I will let Craig take over from here. Enjoy.
I am so grateful to have this opportunity to answer some bonus questions. And the first one is going to be, this question might seem totally out of the blue, but I noticed you had 2 tattoos on your lower arm. Did you have them before your time in prison or did you get them after? And what do they mean? This is super fun for me because after I got out of prison, I got way into Stoicism. I discovered the works of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. And there are a couple of core Stoic tenets that really stuck out to me. And I have them tattooed on me. First one is on my left arm. It is amor fati, and that is Latin for love of fate or love of one's fate. And I really love that because I think it just encompasses so much acceptance. And part of the reason I got it was not only the acceptance, but it was Nietzsche actually describes it in such a beautiful, powerful way that compelled me to actually get this tattoo. And I'll say his quote now. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it. And I just thought that was so powerful and such a wonderful reminder to connect with that everything happens for a purpose, and that it's up to us to make this purpose something positive and active. And then on my right arm, I have memento mori, and that is Latin for remember you will die or remember you must die. People translate it a couple of different ways. And there are times when I tell people that where they will cringe and they will make a face because it sounds morbid, but it's not. It is a reminder that life is short and that life is precious and what a gift it actually is. And so when I find myself in a challenging situation, I will look down to my arms as just a reminder, as a talisman, to say, remember, I will die. And that gives me fuel oftentimes to move through that challenging situation. And if something happens that is not the way I wanted it to turn out, if the outcome was off from what I was actually thinking, I look to amor fati and just have a love of fate and to understand it happened as it was meant to happen. I also have, as a bonus I'll throw in there, nobody can see it because I haven't even actually shown them, I have another Stoic quote on my left rib cage. It is from Marcus Aurelius, and that is, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And the reason I got this was when I got out of prison, I got a job at a gym. I was really fortunate to land that job, but I was still thinking I could get back into corporate, even though there's a court order barring me from going back into my old industry. And I went on interviews outside of the industry I was barred from in the corporate world. And I went on these interviews and I did fairly well. And eventually it would come up that I had committed a federal offense. And oftentimes the interviewer would say, I don't have a problem with it, but we'll check with HR. And HR always had a problem with it. And I never got any of these jobs and I felt very frustrated. But the fact of the matter is, I didn't want to go back to corporate. I wanted to create something of my own. I wanted to create something new, something of value, something that was of service, whether that be speaking or writing or my coaching business. And so the impediment was my crime, was this record, was the choices that I made. And I realized that that was actually the way. That was what I had to lean towards, what I had to lean into and to actually do. And so that's why I got that quote on my ribs. I would love to probably get a few more. My tattoo artist is amazing. My friend Natasha out of New York City. She's absolutely incredible, beautiful human being who's so gifted. And I feel bad having her just put words on me because she does such stunning imagery. So I might come up with something that actually utilizes her full skill set. The next question: what was something you did not share in your TEDx talk that you wish you had? And this is a great question because there is something, I was so thrilled to deliver that TEDx and what that TEDx represented. That was the ultimate expression of working through my number one fear of public speaking. And I was so grateful to have the opportunity to do it. I was so grateful to deliver the talk that I delivered. However, there is something that I do wish that I had included in my bullet points. And I wish I had included the analogy of the ancient Japanese art of kintsugi. When a piece of pottery is broken, it is not immediately discarded. In fact, an artist will take the broken pieces and they'll put it back together. And oftentimes they use a lacquer made out of silver, gold, sometimes even platinum, to reassemble whatever it is that was broken, a plate, a bowl. And the finished product, the reassembled product, is more beautiful than the original. And it's beautiful because of its cracks. Its cracks are what make it beautiful. And the same applies to us and our stories and our shame and where we think that we are broken. That's actually what makes us beautiful. And I wish I had included that. And I wish I had also taken it a little bit further, that if we deny our cracks, if we deny a part of what makes us who we are, and our past can't be anything other than it is a part of who we are, whether we like it or not. And amorphity actually tells us to love it, which circles right back to that first question. However, if we deny a piece of who we are, how will we ever be whole? How will we ever be complete? And I think knowing that we are enough is a core foundational piece to living an extraordinary life. And if I was to deny my story, my felony, my quote unquote cracks, then I'm denying a piece of myself, and I can never be whole. And that is what I wish I included in my TEDx talk. The next question: the days can often be more manageable than the nights, because at night, all kinds of thoughts can come to the surface. That is so powerful and so true. Knowing you were going to prison, what thoughts often kept you awake? Or what did you do before you went off to bed? Before I went to prison, some of the thoughts that kept me awake, before I realized that I was most likely going to go to what's called a federal prison camp where my safety wouldn't be of concern, I was kept awake by the thought of being raped and beaten every day. I thought prison was going to be like what I see on TV and in the movies, and just the horrors that we read about and that we see prison being presented as. And that's something that kept me up. I was kept up by thoughts of my wife divorcing me, basically knowing that I had destroyed our marriage because I broke the foundational piece of any relationship, which is trust. I knew I broke that. So I was worried about her leaving me. I was worried about where I was going to live, where I was going to work, what my future could possibly be since I burnt everything to the ground. It was such a weight to carry. The time between getting arrested and actually going to prison was one of the worst times of my entire life, because it is just a dark cloud of uncertainty that follows everything. And to your question, to the point of the question, all of that seems to come to a head at night. And that was just so difficult to manage and to deal with. And eventually I would end up going to sleep just out of sheer exhaustion. It just got to the point where I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. And fortunately, my body would kick in and just put me to sleep. We'll go to the next section, life in prison. What did your daily routine look like in prison? There's a saying in prison that the days are really slow, but the weeks are really fast. And the reason I bring that up is that prison is all about routine. It is all about just checking another day off of the calendar. And you do that by establishing a routine. So my routine was pretty set in stone. I worked in the prison kitchen 3.5 days out of the week. So on the days that I worked, my mornings were almost all identical. I would wake up around 5:45 in the morning, and I would go to the library. I would make a cup of powdered coffee and powdered cream, and I would go to the library. And I woke up that early because oftentimes I was the only person in the library, which was really beneficial because I would meditate. I would meditate first thing in the morning for about 20 minutes. Then I would start my gratitude practice and my journaling practice. And at this point, people were coming in and out of the library, and it wasn't as bad, but I loved getting that meditation done before other people would come in. It's not to say that they wouldn't, and people didn't quite understand meditation, and I would oftentimes get interrupted, which I suppose makes my meditation practice that much deeper now, having dealt with some of those interruptions then. And then after the morning routine of meditation and journaling and gratitude, then oftentimes I would have a client that I would train in the prison gym. People found out that I used to be a personal trainer, so I had a roster of clients. And so I would go to the gym and I would train them, which was really so nice because it gave me something to do. It gave me a sense of meaning. I had some people who were not in the best of shape, and it really was so nice to be able to help them. And it was so nice to see them using their time to their advantage. And I loved that. Then it was usually time to go to work. And work would keep me busy. We would have to prepare lunch and dinner for approximately, there was about 116 to 118 of us. So it was, it's pretty big meals. There were about 3 or 4 of us in the kitchen. And that was just anything from cutting more peppers than I would ever care to imagine, peeling more potatoes than I would ever care to imagine, and just following the menu. But we had a good group of guys in the kitchen. We actually would have a decent time. There were so many jobs in prison that somebody could get, and the kitchen was actually one of the few where we really had to work, but you had access to food, so it made it totally worth it because food in prison is gold. It's absolute gold. So after we prepared lunch, I'd eat lunch. And then I would do some more writing. I would start writing my book, or I would go and read. And depending on the weather, it was either in the library or out on one of the picnic tables. The prison I was in actually was, for all intents and purposes, quite pretty to look at. We had decent landscaping. We had deer. We had turkeys. We had cats. I have to say, it really took some of the edge off a really terrible experience. And then we would go back into the kitchen and prepare dinner. And dinner was served at 4 p.m. So apparently prison thinks that we're all a bunch of elderly people who want to eat the early bird special and eat at 4 o'clock. You get used to it, but it really did suck. And after we were done with that, we would have to clean the kitchen, and then it was maybe back to the gym for my own workout or some other clients, and then the nightly TV, which would start with Jeopardy and then whatever DVD somebody was able to smuggle in, or whatever TV show we happened to all be watching at the time. And I would go to sleep every single night after the 10 o'clock count. And that was pretty much what my days looked like in prison. The next question: your nickname was Smiley. Why do people in prison give all these nicknames to each other? And obviously, I read these questions before I answered them. And I've given this one some thought. And I have to say, I don't actually know. I don't know why people do it. I can only foster and put together a guess. And that is, prison is very dehumanizing. And I think giving nicknames adds a level of humanity to it, and it adds a level of camaraderie between the inmates. I also think that there's a little bit of an opportunity for people you can establish some really good friendships in prison. I was with some really incredible people, but I knew that it was temporary. At first I thought I was going to stay in touch with everyone, but then I started realizing that this is temporary, and this was a chapter of my life that it's okay to close and not keep in touch with everyone. And I'm not sure if everybody else realized that as well or thought the same thing, but maybe those nicknames help facilitate that process, help facilitate the temporary nature of our relationship. That's some thoughts I had around that, but again, I'm not really sure. Next question: what were the prison inmates you met like? What lessons did you learn from them? I touched upon that a little bit in the previous question, but my friends were some of the nicest, most generous, most empathetic, and caring people that I could imagine. And I'm so grateful for the friends that I did make in prison. Prison I went to was a federal prison camp. So we had white collar offenders and nonviolent drug offenders. So we had a fairly wide array of people. And I thought that was super interesting because you could really, I lived next door, my cubicle was next door to a billionaire. And then just a couple of beds away was somebody who was a drug dealer. And prison is a great equalizer. It didn't matter that somebody was a drug dealer. It didn't matter that somebody was a billionaire. None of that mattered. And I really thought that was just such an interesting part of prison. And the lessons learned. My bunkie, I was really fortunate to have the bunkie that I had. His bunkie was going to be leaving or getting shifted to another bunk. I can't quite remember. And he wanted to make sure that he had somebody coming in that was clean, that behaved themselves. You know, who you bunkie with, who you partner up with is extremely important. It's going to make your life, your quality of life that much better. So he was scouting people and he saw that I behaved myself, that I was clean, that I did the quote unquote right things. And he knew my best friend. And he said, hey, I think I'd like him as my bunkie. Talk to him. So my friend said, he would like to be your bunkie. He wants you to move in, which I thought was really strange because quite frankly, on the surface, I thought he was a really scary looking guy. Not that he was this big, scary dude. He was actually in his mid 60s, but just carried himself in such a way that he was a very powerful individual. And there was an intimidation there. And I wasn't sure if I really wanted to room with him. And my friend said, this will be really good for you. And it turns out that it was. He was such an incredible man. He would listen to my concerns and my problems. And he would just tell me like it was. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He once said to me, the question was, what did I learn from them? I wanted to ask my wife at the time, who had actually already told me that she was leaving me, wanted to ask her a question. And there was a 50% chance that the answer was really going to be devastating to me. And I ran the question by him. And he said, don't ever ask a question where there is a 50% chance that the answer is going to destroy you. I thought that was really, really so interesting. And something else that I learned from him, I'll never forget the day that I came in from the gym and he was sitting in our cube on his bed, kind of just in contemplation, just somewhere else in his thoughts. He saw me walk in and he says, grab a seat. I want to show you something. So I sat down and he gets on his knees and goes underneath his bunk and he pulls out this box that's buried out of view because you're not supposed to have boxes underneath your bunk. And he pulls it out and he goes through a couple of books and he pulls out just this stunning looking photo album. It is the softest leather and just this beautiful ivory color. And I remember thinking to myself, this is the most beautiful thing in the entire prison. And I didn't know what it was, but he opens it up and I see a bride and groom. And I immediately understood what it was. It was his daughter's wedding album. And I also knew that he was unable to attend his daughter's wedding because he was in prison. His son walked her down the aisle. And we just sat in quiet thought. He would flip through the pages and it was just a beautiful, stunning wedding. And just you could just see the happiness and joy on everybody's faces. And you could see the sadness and the love in my bunkie's face. And he would explain stuff to me, who this person was, where they held it, because these were all strangers to me. But I realized this was an extremely well-educated man, an extremely wealthy man. And I realized at that moment that his money didn't mean anything to him. It's the experiences that matter. It's family that matters. And I just really remember sitting there because this is somebody I would have compared myself to prior to prison. I would have been trying to keep up with him, to catch up with him. And instead, we're both equals looking at this photo album, wishing we were somewhere else. And it was just a very grounding and a very bonding moment. And I'm really quite grateful for that. We'll go on to the next question. Who is Ed? Can you tell us something about him? When did he enter the picture? I'll give a little background on this. Ed was the person who came up with the title of my book, Blank Canvas, How I Reinvented My Life After Prison. When I first arrived in prison, I don't really know what other prisons look like, but I know where I went, how they handle things. My first day, when I checked in, I was assigned a mentor, and that mentor was Ed. Ed was in his mid-60s, super intelligent man. He was serving, I believe, 9 years for a Ponzi scheme, for a $60 million Ponzi scheme. And Ed really took me under his wing and showed me the ropes, just got me set up on email, got me set up on how to use the phone. That may sound silly, but you just can't pick up the phone and dial out when you're in prison. It doesn't work that way. So he had to show me all of these steps. And Ed was responsible for the education department. He was responsible for setting up our different classes. And, it was so nice to have those classes and to have somebody who was facilitating them, who actually cared about teaching in such a way that would land. And I really am so thankful to him for that. Ed was also, and this is kind of funny, we could buy different things on commissary, including Oreo cookies. And so I developed a massive sweet tooth for Oreo cookies. Ed and I were known in the camp as the people, if you needed Oreos, you could go to Ed and I, and we always had Oreos. My locker was filled with more Oreos than you could possibly imagine. I don't really know why. I mean, Oreos are delicious, but I always made sure I had plenty of them. But how Ed was able to come up with the title of my book it's interesting how it actually happened. I had the opportunity to sit down with my friend and fellow author, Kamal Ravikant. And if you're not familiar with Kamal's works, Kamal has written just some beautiful, powerful books. Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends Upon It. Live Your Truth. That happens to be my personal favorite of his. And Rebirth. And I was sitting down to lunch with Kamal, and I told him the following story. So when you're in prison, this might sound really strange, but you don't actually know the exact date that you're leaving. Because from prison, you'll go to what's called a halfway house. And the halfway house is as it sounds. It is the halfway point between prison and the real world. And that date of when you go there is completely up in the air. You've got to do a certain amount of time of your sentence in prison. The halfway house has to have a bed available for you to actually move into. So there are so many factors, and there's so many things that can either facilitate or get in the way of going to the halfway house. So that date it's somewhere out there, and it's super frustrating because I really wanted to go to the halfway house, because the halfway house, I was still under the auspices of the Bureau of Prisons, but I could leave during the day. I could go to a job. I could go to the gym. I could go to the laundromat. It was a taste of freedom, and I really, really wanted that freedom. So not knowing when I was going to go was really frustrating. And then one day, I got the date when I'd be leaving prison to go to the halfway house. And it was so exciting. It was such elation to know that I was going to have this taste of freedom. And then it came with a sheer amount of terror. I had no job. I was or I am a federally convicted felon. Who's going to hire me? I didn't have a place to live at the time. My wife had divorced me. Who's going to date a felon? All of these things started weighing on me so much. And they really started putting me in a panic. And I remember Ed and I were walking down the hallway of the education building on our way to anger management class. Ed was teaching. I was a student. I don't have anger issues, but prison is very much like high school. Certain classes look good on your manuscript, and anger management was one of them. Plus, it was wickedly entertaining. So we were walking to class, and Ed knew that I was going to be going to the halfway house. And he asked me, he said, "How do you feel?" And I just told him everything I had just said. I said, "I don't have a job. Who's going to hire a felon? My wife is divorcing me. Who's going to date a felon? I don't have a place to live. What am I going to do?" Just all the panic. And Ed put his arm around me and he said, "Craig, you have a blank canvas. You can paint whatever picture you want." And I told Kamal that story, and Kamal looked at me. He knew I was writing the book. He said, "Craig, that's the title of your book, Blank Canvas." And then he looks up, he's thinking about it. He says, "Blank Canvas, how I recreated my life after prison." He goes, "That's your title, that's your subtitle." And I thought it was so cool, and it stuck. And later I changed recreated to reinvented. And that is the story of Ed. Now we'll go to the next question. From what I gathered, you read a lot of books in prison. Yes, I did. Which books did you read, and which ones helped you the most? I'm going to list 3 books that were critical to me in prison. First one is Unbroken by Laura Hildebrand. And Unbroken is the story of Louis Zamperini, who his plane was shot down during World War II. And I love this. My friend in prison suggested I read it. And the way he describes this book, I think, captures it perfectly. After his plane was shot down in the Pacific, he was on a raft with his co-pilot. They had just a little bit of chocolate. They had no fresh water. The first night, his co-pilot ate all of their food. Then they're sitting in the middle of the Pacific. The sun is baking them, and they hear a plane, and they don't know if it's friend or foe. Well, the plane starts shooting at them with a machine gun, and they have to jump into the water to avoid it. When they jump in the water, they realize that it's shark-infested waters. They have to climb back into the boat to get away from the sharks. The plane would circle back around, start shooting at them again. They had to jump from the boat into the water where the sharks were. They went back and forth like this over and over again. And as my friend who was describing this book to me said, he goes, and that's the best his life got. And it was such a huge perspective shift. And I really, really loved that book. The second was a book that I had already read, but really reconnected with it inside prison. And that was The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. That is one of my all-time favorite books. I revisit it once or twice a year. And every single time I read it, I get something new out of it. And there is a quote by Heraclitus that says, "No man stands in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." And that book to me encompasses why I reread. And that's why I get something new every single time I read the words that I've already read so many times. But that book is just a reminder that, how do I express this? How do I say this? That you just keep going for things. You just keep moving forward. And there's a great line from it that when you, I'm not going to get this 100% correct, but when you decide to do something, the universe conspires to help make it happen. And I really loved that. And then the third book, and I saved this for last because I think this is the most important one, is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I honestly believe that that should be mandatory reading for every single person. That is such a tremendously poignant and powerful book that completely shifted my perspective on life. It was so touching to read what he went through, I believe, 6 different concentration camps, and losing everything. And still, through all of that, keeping a level of hope. And Viktor Frankl was influenced by Stoicism. And I actually believe that is how I got into Stoicism in the first place, was through reading Man's Search for Meaning. And I just love that book. That's another one that I will revisit yearly. And there are times when I'm walking through my apartment and I see it on the bookshelf. I'll just pull it off the bookshelf and I will flip to a highlighted passage and I'll read a few of my highlighted passages. And just as a reminder, as a grounding force, and I'll just put the book back on the bookshelf. There were a ton of other ones. I read some silly books. I read some other serious books. I read a lot of Paulo Coelho, which I really, really enjoyed. This was an important one. I read Choose Yourself by James Altucher. That was critical in changing my thought process and what was possible for me in terms of creating a business after prison, of literally choosing myself and doing something that I wanted to do. And it really was so fun to read, and so, what's the word? It was so creative. It allowed me to tap into a level of creativity because he suggests writing down 10 ideas a day, which is a practice that I still do to this day. And I'm unbelievably grateful that James wrote the blurb for my book. I'm just blown away by that. I think that's so cool. Next question. Was it in prison that you tried meditation for the first time? What convinced you to start meditating? And what did it do for you? Yes, meditation started in prison. I'd always wanted to meditate before prison, but I always, I said I should meditate. I knew the benefits from it. I read about it from Tim Ferriss and all the other people in that genre, how great meditation is. And I said, yeah, I should do that. But I never found the time. And now in prison, there's nothing but time. So it became very easy to start a meditation practice because it gave me something to do. And I knew that I had to take that time and I had to do something. I wanted to do something productive. And at the time, I also thought I was completely broken and I needed to fix myself. And I saw meditation as being a tool that would allow me to fix myself. Now, and I do this work with my clients, and I tell everybody who's listening, you're not broken, you don't need to be fixed. But I do highly suggest meditation because meditation gives me, I started journaling in prison, and I started journaling on this one word. It was the gap. And what I meant by that was the gap between something happening and my response. And there's a really great Viktor Frankl quote: in between stimulus and response, there is a space. Within that space is your growth and your freedom. And that's why I meditate, because meditation increases that space. It increases what I was calling that gap. And that is one of the things that it did for me. And it's still a practice that I do to this day, including journaling and gratitude. Next question. Someone listening right now might have suicidal thoughts. With the experience you've had and having worked through these feelings, what could you suggest to them? This is a very, very powerful and important question. First thing that I would suggest is communication, is communicating with someone how you feel. And that may sound so daunting and so frightening. And you might not want to burden somebody with your troubles. You might be embarrassed that you're having these thoughts that, why can't I fix this? Why can't I move through it on my own? I can assure anybody listening to this, if you were to share those feelings with somebody else that cares and loves for you, They are not going to judge you. They are going to listen. And there's a good chance that they have felt the same exact way that you're feeling now. Because, and we spoke about this on our first podcast, everybody has at some point in their life had that flash of a thought of, I want to kill myself. It may just be a quick flash. It may be something much deeper, but everybody has experienced that. And when we are in the pits of despair, in that consumption of shame, we feel like we're the only person feeling that way. And when we communicate and when we're open and we share with somebody else, we realize that we're not. And just that alone is such an incredible step out of that darkness. You may still be in the darkness, but it's that one step out through communication. Something else that I would suggest for people who find themselves in this terrible and horrible place is to know that it's temporary. And if you're in that place right now, may not feel that way, may feel like you're going to feel like that for the rest of your life. And when I say that it's temporary, you may say, bullshit, I don't believe it. There's no way. What do you know? I know I probably would have said that if somebody said that to me when I was in the throes of it. But I can assure you, it is temporary. It is finite. And suicide is a final solution to a very temporary problem. And that's something that I think is so, so important. And another thought is to ask yourself, to bring some awareness into it and say, do I really want to die, or do I just not want to feel like this anymore? And when we realize that we just don't want to feel the way that we're feeling, we can connect with that knowledge that that feeling is temporary, that it's got an expiration date on it. We may not know what that expiration date is, but knowing that something has an expiration date helps make it that much more bearable. And I believe it bears repeating. It is communication. Don't hold it in. The more that you hold it in, the more that it's going to grow, the more it's going to fester, the more power it's going to have over you. Communication is key. Understanding that it is temporary, also very key. Asking yourself, do I want to die, or do I just not want to feel this way anymore? And one more thing I'd like to add is, I read this somewhere. I believe it was on Tim Ferriss's blog, and I believe he borrowed it from somebody else. So I don't know who that is, and I would love to give them credit because I think it is so beautifully said. But if you're in the midst of feeling suicidal and that pain that you're experiencing, if you were to go through with the act, take all that pain that you're feeling, multiply it by 1,000, and put it into your loved ones' hearts, because that's exactly what's going to happen. And I believe that's a real perspective shift and something that I hope can snap people out of it. I hope that answered it. And thank you for asking such an important question. We'll go on to the next section, reinventing and rebuilding life. How did you rebuild trust again after breaking that of your loved ones, like friends and family? Trust comes from action. We can say a million different things, but it comes from action. That is the only way that we can truly build trust. And for me to be able to rebuild that trust, which was, yes, broken, but I have such an amazing support system in my friends and family. They were very easily and quickly able to forgive me, and I believe give that trust back to me. And I'm really grateful for that. But before I could even get to that point, I had to rebuild trust in myself. And I think that is for anybody who has broken trust with friends and family, is to really build that trust within yourself first. Then the trust with others will start flowing. And a really easy way to build that self-trust is making and keeping commitments to yourself. It could be, I'm going to work out 3 times this week. I am going to do X. But really making the commitment, sticking with that commitment, and celebrating yourself after you keep that commitment. Because when you start doing that over and over again, you become a person who does what they say they're going to do. And when you start doing that repetitively, you start building that trust. And you build that trust in yourself. And when you build that trust in yourself, then you really can start rebuilding it with those around you. Next question. What could you suggest to people who feel like there's no hope in life because of something they went through? I'm going to give a very short answer to this, followed by a slightly longer answer. Your past cannot define you without your consent. I think that is so critical to remember. And I'll repeat it. Your past cannot define you without your consent. And why that is so important to remember is that the past is in the past. It can't be anything other than what it is. And when we start understanding that and practicing acceptance of that, that is that moment that we can accept that which cannot be changed as face value, as the truth, no elaboration, no stories. For me, it is, I am a federally convicted felon. I accept that. I accept I made the choices that I made. And when we start doing that, that acceptance can really sting in the beginning. It can really hurt. But we now have a baseline in which to start over. And when we get through that initial sting of acceptance, we can have that glimmer of hope. We can have that glimmer of hope because we have a baseline in which to start over. It may not be the most optimal baseline in which to start over, but we have a baseline. And having that baseline is extremely empowering. And when we empower ourselves, we can have that glimmer of hope. And I'm going to circle back to the suicide question. And I want to bring in another, one of the components that I mentioned in that, which is things are temporary. It may feel like there's no hope, but that's a feeling that there's no hope. That feeling is temporary. And we can work through that when we start practicing acceptance. Thank you so much for this opportunity to do this bonus episode. This was so much fun. The questions were so amazing. And I want to acknowledge you again for having a platform for people to share their stories and for sharing your story so openly and honestly so that others can do the same. So thank you again. And I look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
And there we have it, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode with Craig Stanland. Anything Craig mentioned, such as book recommendations, interesting people, etc., can be found in the show notes located in the description of this episode. Or you can also always go directly to innerpicturestories.com/podcast and search for Craig to find them. If you'd like to listen to the full interview I did with Craig on episode 028 titled Life After Prison, Craig Stanland, Losing Everything You Have and How to Start Over, you can also find the link located in the show notes. Or, of course, if you're listening to this episode from a podcast app, just check the list of episodes to find it there. With that, thank you for listening to the IPS Podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode with Craig Stanland. As well, I hope to welcome you again soon on another episode here on the IPS Podcast.